Hi, young adults. We are going to go over Module 61 from your textbook for AP Psych. So, Module 61 is talking about the origins of intelligence testing. So, the previous video I made talked about the different theories of intelligence. Is intelligence a single factor, like Spearman's going to say? It's several factors, like Gardner with multiple intelligences, or Thurstone with his 7 different types of intelligence, or Sternberg when he comes up with 3, right? So the focus for this video is going to be talking about the origins of intelligence testing. So how did the testing come about? Who are some of the people that were key in developing intelligence tests? And then what are the different principles of test construction to make a quality, if you will, test? Okay, so the questions that you're going to see up here, these were just kind of some review questions from Module 60. That you should be able to answer, right? You don't actually have a packet for this, so just ignore that last bullet. Okay. So when we're talking about intelligence testing, when and why were intelligence tests created, right? So intelligence testing first began in the 20th century, so the 1900s, specifically in France. Okay. There was a French law that was passed in the 1900s that required all children to attend school. That was one of the first laws of that nature, where all kids, no matter what your age is, you now have to go to school. And so teachers, they organized kids by grade level, but you might have, 25 kids who are all 12 years old. So you put them in a classroom together, and some of them can read and some of them can't, right? So you've got a wide variety of students in one room who have a wide variety of knowledge or intelligence, if you will. And once again, that's a very academically defined version of intelligence. So in France, when you put all of these children in one room of the same age with various backgrounds, are students who don't know how to read, is it because of academic slowness? As in, like, they're struggling to comprehend? And is it because they're struggling to comprehend because mentally they're relatively slow? Or is it because they have inadequate prior education? Meaning, like, some of the kids in that classroom can read because their parents taught them to read, right? And so you have some kids in the room who can read and some who can't. What is kind of the cause of those differences in intelligence, right? So, it was believed in France that teachers shouldn't decide whether or not some children were slow. I'm using that, I did air quotes, you can't see me, but slow, mentally slow, because teachers might be prejudging children based on their social backgrounds, right? So this kid's poor, so maybe he doesn't know how to read. So France didn't want teachers making those decisions and judging, so they commissioned Alfred Binet to actually study children in France, right? So he is going to work on assessing intelligence. This is kind of the first time, right? And something to think about is how might intelligence tests keep students back in school, right? So if you take a test and let's say you don't do well on it, how could that keep people back? But also, how could it help students succeed, right? So if you take an intelligence test and you score well on it, are you placed with other people who also score highly? And does scoring highly on intelligence reflect the knowledge that you need or are learning in school, right? And this kind of comes back to the idea of, like, are there different types of intelligence? So that man right there, that's Alfred Binet. He is the one who is studying intelligence in France. He believes that intelligence was the equivalent of having, like, good judgment, right? You have to remember these are very loosely defined ideas of what intelligence is. There's no way to see inside the brain at this point to figure out even what's happening in terms of intelligence. So he's going to say that intelligence is having good judgment. He's going to assume that all children follow the same intellectual development, right? So you're all going to progress through, concrete thinking and then abstract thinking, but just that some people will develop more rapidly than others, right? So some people are more advanced because they move quicker than other people. His goal was to measure mental age, right? So mental age is a term in your book. Mental age is talking about the level of performance typically associated with your chronological age. So we can talk about this, like my chronological age, I just turned 33, right? So my chronological age is 33, but my mental age, so you'd have to give me some type of assessment. And my mental age would be like, does my performance on this assessment correlate on average to other people who are of the same chronological age? So hopefully my mental age is the equivalent of my chronological age, or maybe even be better than that, would be if my mental age was actually higher than my chronological age, right? So if my intelligence was at like that of a 45-year-old and my chronological age is a 33, I'm 33, the idea would be that my development would be more rapid than other people. Okay. One criticism of Binet is that there's no explanation as to why a child is deemed slow, average, or gifted. Just this test is meant to help you figure out if the child is slow, average, or gifted. Okay. That takes us to Louis Terman. He was a professor at Stanford University, and he is going to try and use Binet's test to measure the intelligence of people at Stanford. But he realized that there was a problem. Some of the questions on the Binet test were culturally specific, right? So there were think of like, have you ever gotten a test question wrong? Not because you didn't know the answer, but because you didn't understand a word in the question. So it's not that you didn't know what the answer was, but you couldn't even answer the question because you didn't know what the question was asking. And so when Binet tries to, or when Louis Terman tries to give the Binet test to students at Stanford, they're doing very poorly on these intelligence tests because there are norms used in the French-based test that don't translate very well to California school children. So think of like cultural norms, word choices that would be present in the question that doesn't necessarily indicate your level of intelligence in the answer, but it would predispose you to get the question wrong, right? So that was an issue that Terman had. Because he had that issue with Binet's test, he's going to revise Binet's test. And his new test that Terman's going to develop is called the Stanford Binet test. Stanford, because he teaches at Stanford. Binet, because he's modifying Binet's test. And Terman's going to say intelligence tests reveal the intelligence with which a person was born. So he's saying that's an innate ability. Okay. That takes us to William Stern. He's the guy who comes up with this whole idea of an IQ, right? An IQ is your intelligence quotient. An IQ is basically your mental age divided by your chronological age times 100. So if my mental age is 33 and my chronological age, I am 33 years old, so that's 1 times 100, then that means my IQ is 100. Okay. This used to be a really popular thing that people would do, is like, what's your IQ? Generally speaking, IQ scores are fairly accurate for children, but it doesn't work so well in terms of measuring intelligence with adults. Today's intelligence tests produce a mental ability score, and your score is relative to average performance of other people, roughly speaking, in your chronological age, right? And the thing I would encourage you to note is 100 is the average score. Right? It's not the highest. 100 is the average score. And normally when they do these intelligence tests, it forms a normal curve. A normal curve is like 50% fall below the average and 50% fall above the average. So 2/3 of all people will score between an 85 and a 115 on the IQ test. So 2/3 of people are going to score between 85 and 115, with 100 being the average. And when William Stern comes up with this idea of like the IQ test, this is during a time period where you're starting to see what's called the eugenics movement. Some of you might have heard of eugenics before. Eugenics was a movement in the 19th century, so the 1800s, that proposed measuring like human intelligence and other traits that are genetic, if you will, and only encouraging people who were smart to reproduce. So what that would look like is only people who were, desirable, in this case, intelligent people, would be allowed to have children because they would genetically be passing down their intelligence to other people. Okay. So that's eugenics. And that kind of was very much linked to intelligence testing. Like we need to test people's intelligence. And what could that be used for? Well, you could be using it to encourage some people to procreate and discouraging others from having children. And then just as, once again, it shows you 100 is considered the normal score in an intelligence test. They're routinely re-standardized, so the 100 remains the accurate normal score. So if I took an intelligence test today and I got 100 on it, like that's the average score, someone who took the score or let's say the test in like the early 1930s and got 100 on it, that would be the equivalent today of like getting a 76 on it. Because they re-standardized the test, and in general, the population is getting smarter. So intelligence testing are getting progressively harder, which means the average of 100 now will be more points than if you had taken it in the 1930s. In terms of modern tests of mental abilities, an aptitude test is a test that's intended to predict your ability to learn a new skill. So college entrance exams, so you just took the SAT, it's meant to predict your ability to do college work. That's the whole point of an aptitude test. So they're trying to test your ability to learn in college. And it is positively correlated. There's a 0.82 correlation between your general intelligence score and how well you do in college. The other type of test is an achievement test. It's intended to reflect what you have learned. So an example of an achievement test is your AP test, right? Your AP Psych test is meant to test on what psychology material you have learned. So that takes us to David Wechsler. David Wechsler was a Romanian immigrant. And he's going to develop his own intelligence test because he's also going to criticize the Stanford Binet and other intelligence tests at that time, saying they're very much biased towards English language speakers, right? That the test was really performance oriented in terms of these ideals that were kind of rooted into the question. So Wechsler took the Stanford Binet test, and his result was that he was quote unquote feeble-minded. Feeble-minded is saying that he was someone of very, very low intellect, which he was not. He became a psychologist. And so he set out to kind of revise this because he thought that the Stanford Binet test was very much biased against people who did not speak English. And so he's going to create what's called the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. So it's the WAIS, W-A-I-S. This is the most commonly used intelligence test. It will give you a general overall intelligence score, but then it will separate your score for different categories. So there's verbal comprehension, perceptual organization, working memory, and processing speech. So kind of like, people used to take the ACT, and there are 4 different categories. So it was like math, reading, there was a science section, and there was like a language section. So where you have your overall score, and then it's broken down into 4 different components. In terms of principles of test construction, there are really 3, right? To be widely accepted, psychology tests must be standardized, reliable, and valid. If something is standardized, it's the process of defining meaningful scores relative to a pre-tested group. So if you want to know what your intelligence is, so your intelligence test score, then you have to have a group to compare it to, right? I'm out of time on this video, so I will be making a part 2 to finish going over principles of test construction. So please go find and click on part 2 video.